currently 8:07 p.m. on a Tuesday. Hey everyone, welcome back. There's not going to be a cohesive structure to this vlog. Haven't posted in a pretty long time, so I played a few sessions since then, and it's just going to be a bunch of hand histories compiled together. Anyways, the first session is going to be a little different. I'm actually playing a home game with my poker group. These are the first and pretty much the only people I know personally who play poker in the area, and I learned a good amount of what I know about poker from them criticizing and berating my play, so thank you guys.
What's wrong with you?
Oh my god.
Oh, actually I was.
We have Michael, Jake, Ton N, and Ton M. We're gonna be playing at 25 cents, 50 cent blinds game, $1, 50 cents, 25 cents, $5, $10. Seems like a pretty good game. It's mostly all fish at the table except for me. Wish me luck. In for 100, out for 0. 2 hours and 25 minutes. Two interesting hands I remember. I have ace queen. I 3-bet to 5, and Jake calls. Flop is king 10-9 rainbow. I c-bet for 5. Jake calls. The turn is the ace of hearts, bringing a backdoor flush draw. I check. Jake checks back. I think I should definitely be betting this turn. It hits my range pretty hard. I think at the time I just want to pot control a little bit, and I didn't think I can get 3 sheets of value, so I decided to plan on betting the river instead of the turn. Not saying that was correct. In hindsight, I should probably bet the turn. Anyways, on with the hand. The river's a queen, offsuit, giving me 2 pair. I bet 10, and Jake shoves for 33. I tank for a while, and eventually call, and Jake has ace-jack for the shake, so lost that one. So in this very specific situation against Jake, he pretty much always has a jack, but at the same time, I'm pretty close to the top of my range. In a short-handed game like this, I could be 3-betting a lot wider, which means I could have weaker aces, weaker 2 pairs, and at the same time, I'm blocking the most realistic hands you could have with the jack in them, which are ace-jack and queen-jack. So for the sake of not being exploitable, I decided to make the call. But unfortunately, in this situation, I was wrong, as I expected to be, so I lost a decent-sized pot there. There's another one where I had ace-8 of clubs. There was a raise to 150, 1 call. I decided to just call. 4 ways to a flop, which is 10-9, low card, 2 clubs. I have the nut flush draw and the backdoor straight draw. Jake checks. This ton bets something like half pot. I think I had like 17 or 18 behind. He bet 3 or 4 into 6. So I shove, it folds to him, he calls. The turn is a 7, making me open-ended, and the river's a 4. We run it a second time, and both the turn and the river then are aces. So he shows queen jack. He's open-ended with 2 overs on the flop, so I scooped that one. Other than that, I can't remember too many other hands. I was trying to enjoy this game and not take too many notes. I haven't seen them in a very long time, so it's a friendly game. Unfortunately, down for $100, so first loss for the vlog.
Ready?
Fuck. 475.
Yeah, you have nothing. What do you have? This is a fucking horrible hand. Alright, fuck it.
You gotta show for the vlog. There we go.
Get down.
The rest of these hands are going to be from several sessions that I played. So first interesting hand comes from a session I played on October 3rd at the Bicycle Casino. There are 2 limps. The under the gun +2 player raises to 6. The low jack calls, the cutoff calls, and I look down at 5-4 suited in the small blind. Typically, this isn't a hand I would 3-bet, but in this specific session, I had a very tight image, and I was getting a lot of folds with my 3-bet, so I think it was an okay situation to 3-bet, given that I am out of position. I could take down the pot, and I have decent playability even when I do get called. So I decided to make it 25. It's kind of on the smaller side, but I think at these stakes, players aren't thinking too much about the price. Usually, if they want to play their hand, they'll just call a 3-bet, and if they don't want to play their hand, they'll fold. So I think sizing it down gives me a better price when I am 3-bet bluffing. Action folds to the low jack, who makes the call, and the cutoff makes the call as well. So we are 3 ways to a flop, which comes 5-5 jack, 2 diamonds. Pretty much as good of a flop as we could ask for. I think betting and checking are both okay options here. I want to bet to get value, of course, and to charge diamond draws. Also, I am going to miss on this board a lot when I have hands like ace king, ace queen, king queen. I shouldn't have trips too often. The only 5x hands I should have are 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited occasionally, and ace-5 suited. And of course, I could also have pocket jacks. So I am pretty close to the top of my range here, and I think checking is okay to protect my range for the times when I missed. So I decided on to check. Not sure if it was the best option. Action is on the low jack, and he decides to put out a bet of 50. The cutoff thinks for a bit and makes the call, and I'm obviously going to put in a raise here with my trips. I'm putting the low jack on a top pair type hand, probably queen jack or jack 10. And at the time, I don't think I put the cutoff on a specific range. I was just kind of thinking I have trips and I need to raise. But looking back on it, the cutoff seems like he could have some kind of flush draw or maybe just some stubborn under pair that wants to peel like 9s or 10s. I have exactly 309 behind, so I think a shove would be pretty standard here. But instead, I actually decide to just take 2 stacks and put them past the line for a bet that ends up being 205. And this is going to sound kind of strange, but the reason for this is because I think announcing all in or putting my entire stack in the middle looks very strong, especially when the low jack bets 50 and the cutoff calls and I am shoving into 2 players. Given the stack sizes, I am going to be committed to the spot 100% of the time. And I think players at these stakes make huge mistakes by not considering the stack sizes. And I figured that if they decide to call a shove, they're going to call 200 or raise anyways, so the result will be exactly the same. But if they don't call a shove, there's a small chance they might call the $200 raise with some kind of flush draw or top pair. And then, of course, they're going to be committed to the spot, and I'm getting value from something that I might not have otherwise gotten value from. So I decided to do this little exploitative play right here. Anyways, action is on the low jack, who finds a fold, and the cutoff pretty quickly shoves for 240. I make the call, of course. The board runs out 3 of clubs, deuce of diamonds. He asks me if I have a flush, and I show my hand, and he shows 6-5 of spades. You'll notice if you look at the board that as long as a 6 didn't show up on the turn of the river, a 5 didn't show up, or the board didn't run out exactly 3 deuce or deuce 3, we would have been chopping this pot, since we would both have trip 5s with the jack kicker and whatever the other overcard was. In this case, a 7 would have been an overcard as well. So you'll notice that I am actually outkicked by the 6 of spades. It's one thing for your opponent to call your 3-bet with 6-5. It's another thing to flop trip 5s when they flop trip 5s as well. And it's a completely other thing to have the board run out in this very unlikely way that causes you to be outkicked by a 6. So pretty brutal beat there, lost a pretty big pot. Not too long afterwards, I am in the big blind with pocket 7s. There are a few limps, and the cutoff shoves for $31. I make the call. I had just rebought for the max, 300, so sitting on a fairly deep stack. Action folds to the low jack, who makes the call. One player all in and heads up to the flop, which comes 7-8 queen, 2 diamonds. I put out a c-bet, of course, for $50, and the low jack makes the call. The turn is the king of clubs, which is a pretty safe card. The low jack only has about 200 behind, so I decide to put him all in. He snap calls. The river comes the 10 of diamonds. I tell him I have a set. He doesn't seem to want to turn over his hand, so I show my 7s, and he turns over 8-6 of diamonds. Another hand not going my way. Very unexpected as well. So one last hand that's not too interesting, but I thought I'd include it just to emphasize how this session went. I am in late position with pocket aces. I'm either in the button or the cutoff, not too sure. So pretty good situation here. An early position player, probably under the gun, limps. I raise it up to 15 and he makes the call. So heads up to a flop, which comes queen 6-6, 2 spades. The early position player checks. I put out a c-bet of $20. He makes the call. The turn is the 8 of spades. So not too good of a card for me. He checks again, so I don't want to inflate the pot too much, but this player was very passive and was playing pretty much fit or fold poker, so it's very likely he was chasing a flush draw. He rarely bets. He pretty much just calls if he has something and folds if he doesn't. So if I bet here and he doesn't have a flush or a flush draw, he's just going to fold. Anyways, I put out a bet of 35, which is kind of a probing bet, and he makes the call again. The river's a blank. He checks it to me again, and I don't think I'm getting too much value from worse, so I check back, and he shows Jack 3 of spades. Anyways, those are all the hands from October 3rd. I booked a loss of $517 that day. So worst session that has shown up on the vlog before, and the second worst losing session that I had had at the time. In the worst session I had, I lost $570, so this wasn't too far off. The next interesting hand comes from a session I played 2 days later on October 5th, also at the Bicycle Casino. In this hand, I am on the button with King Jack of spades. There are a few limps. I raise it up to 15 and get called by the small blind, the under the gun player, and the hijack. So 4 ways to a flop, which comes Queen Ace Jack, 2 diamonds. So not the worst flop, also not the best though. It is a very scary board. The small blind checks and the under the gun player decides to bet 40. The hijack makes the fold. I ask the player how much he has behind because he doesn't look like he's sitting on too big of a stack, and he says 145. The under the gun player could definitely have plenty of diamond draws here, so gonna peel at least once. The small blind makes the fold, so we're heads up to a turn card, which comes the king of diamonds. Not the worst card, but also not the best card given that it completes the flush. But the good news is the under the gun player checks. I decide to check back and try to get to showdown. The river is a blank, and this time the under the gun player shoves for his remaining 145. Just about a pot size bet, so we're in a pretty tough spot. I think he probably would bet a flush if he hit it on the turn, but definitely reasonable to think he might check as well. It's a trap, since he probably has the hand locked up pretty well. Anyways, I eventually decide to make the call, and he reluctantly shows ace-7 offsuit for top pair, so ended up taking this one down. It definitely could have been a call or a fold in my opinion on the river, so if you have any insight into this hand, let me know. That was the only interesting hand from that session. I ended up booking a win of $364. This next hand comes from a session I played on October 14th, which was also at the Bicycle Casino. I looked down at pocket kings in the small blind. There are a few limps. I raise it up to 20, and the under the gun player calls. He was a pretty solid tight aggressive player. I had seen him play pretty standard so far, so definitely going to consider that as I play this hand. Heads up to a flop, which comes 3-5-9, 2 hearts. I put out a c-bet of $30, and the under the gun player raises to 85, leaving himself only 130-ish behind. Kind of a weird situation. If I make this call, the pot's going to be over $200 and he'll have 130 behind, so I am going to be committed a lot of the time. Again, it's one of those situations where I think 3-bet shoving might be a good option because he could be raising with a lot of heart draws, but again, I'm only getting action from probably sets. Can't see any 2-pair combos he'd have on this board. Obviously not going to fold here, so I eventually decide on a call. The turn is the 5 of diamonds, which is a pretty safe card. Obviously makes it less likely that he has sets and doesn't bring the flush draw. I check it over to him, and he actually decides to check back. The river is not the best card. It's Jack of Hearts, so the flush gets there. I check it over to him again, and this time he shoves for his remaining 130 or so. I think I'm betting my ace-high flushes almost all the time on the river, so I can eliminate a lot of those from my range. The only sets that I should realistically have are pocket 9s and pocket jacks, but 9s are probably shoving the flop anyways, so it looks like the best hands I have here are like pocket jacks, pocket aces. I guess I could possibly have 10-9 of hearts, which makes a flush on the river. Some worse hands I could have, maybe like ace-9 suited that aren't hearts, and possibly pocket queens and pocket 10s. Other than that, I don't see too many worse hands as well, so I tank for quite a bit of time and then eventually decide on a fold. The other player says queens were good, which kind of threw me off because I don't see any hands he could have in his range that are worse than queens and 5s in this situation. He could have been raising a flop with something like Jack 10 of hearts, but obviously the Jack of hearts is on the board, so he can't really have that. I highly doubt he has something like pocket 10s because he probably would have raised that under the gun instead of limping. He's also probably not raising the flop if he has something like 10-9 unless it's a 10-9 of hearts, but obviously 10-9 of hearts is now beating my hand, so I really don't think he has any bluffs here that are worse than pocket queens, so not too sure if I believe him. Anyways, he doesn't show his hand, so I guess I'll never know. Out of all the hands that will be in this vlog, is probably the most confusing one, so I'm going to give this hand a gold star, and if you remember from the previous episode, that means this is something I'm confused about, and I would like to hear your opinion on it. So if you have any feedback or if there's anything I missed, please let me know in the comments. That was the only interesting hand from that session. Ended up booking a loss of $18. Before we end this episode, I want to talk about one last hand that isn't very interesting analytically, but I just have to include it. This hand comes from the session I played on October 5th. I am in the cutoff, I believe, with Jack 10 of hearts. I open and get called by, I think, the big blind. So we're heads up to a flop, which comes 8, queen 3, 3 hearts. So we flop to flush. Big blind checks, and on boards like this at lower stakes, I've found that in my experience, players will generally play their hands pretty face up. They either have a flush or they're scared of the flush. So I decide to check back, hoping to bet on later streets so that my opponent will give me less credit for having a flush. We are still heads up to a turn, which brings the 9 of hearts. So we turned ourselves a straight flush. I believe this is the first time I've ever hit a straight flush, so pretty awesome. Fortunately, the other player checks again, and by the same logic as before, I decide to check back. I do want to build a pot, of course, and I do want to get value, but once the board gets even more scary than it already was, I think betting here will push my opponent off anything that isn't a flush. The river brings the ace of hearts, so now there is a flush on the board, so it's a pretty good card. If I've convinced him that I didn't have a flush on the flop and on the turn, then he should think we're chopping this a lot of the time. Unfortunately though, he decides to check, and now I'm hoping to get some value. I put out a bet of probably 2/3 pot or even close to pot, hoping to make it look like a bluff, and unfortunately he quickly folds. I show my hand, of course, so I can get a picture. So didn't get as much value as I would have wanted to out of my straight flush, but pretty cool to hit it, although I can't help but be a tiny bit disappointed about the fact that if only the 9 of hearts had been the king of hearts, I would have rivered myself a royal flush, which would have been sick. Anyways, still happy to have hit that. And as I was cashing out for the session, I happened to run into Ryan Feldman, commentator for Live at the Bike, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. If you're already following my Instagram, which you should be, then you probably have already seen this picture. So pretty awesome to hit a straight flush and then run into a pretty well-known person in poker. So there's still plenty of interesting hands to go over, but I personally don't like watching videos that are 20 minutes long. So I'm actually going to split this into 2 different videos. The next episode will be full of just pure hand histories, which I don't think people will mind because people seem to like them. So you can expect that to come very soon because I've already played all the hands that I'm going to talk about. I apologize for not including whole card footage. I didn't go to any of these sessions expecting to vlog. I was in the process of editing the 3rd poker vlog and I didn't want to have a backlog of a bunch of footage that I would have to edit. So I decided to just hold off on the whole card cam footage as it does take a long time to edit that in as well. You can expect to see whole card cam footage in future episodes. Until then, that's it for this episode. I will see you in the next one. Thanks.